Number four, we don't have to believe Dr. Ford to conclude that Judge Kavanaugh should not be elevated to the Supreme Court because he has demonstrated that he lacks the temperament and demeanor to be a justice of the Supreme Court. Now, first, I think it's only fair to state the standard. What should the standard for temperament and demeanor for a judge be? Here's the standard as I have seen it. To be a good judge and a good umpire, it's important to have the proper demeanor. Really important, I think, to walk in the other's shoes, whether it be the other litigants, the litigants in the case, the other judges, to understand them, to keep our emotions in check. To keep our emotions in check. To be calm amidst the storm. On the bench, to put it in the vernacular, don't be a jerk. To show, this isn't me, this is a standard published, to show and help display that you are trying to make the decision impartially and dispassionately, based on the law and not based on your emotions. Who established that standard? Who wrote it? Brett Kavanaugh. Those are his words in a speech several years ago at Catholic University. Proper demeanor. Calm amidst the storm. On the bench, don't be a jerk. Help display you're trying to make decisions impartially and dispassionately based on the law and not based on your emotion. I don't see how anybody can, with a straight face, can argue that Brett Kavanaugh met that standard last Thursday afternoon. I had an interesting experience that day. I was in a hearing in the afternoon while he was speaking, and there was a television screen in the hearing room, but the sound was off because we were doing other committee work. But every now and then you could look at the screen, I could see him. And I turned to the person sitting behind me and said, he's coming unhinged. What's going on? What's he saying? He's shouting. You could see it. You could see his face contorted. And then, of course, I saw what he was saying. No one could argue that he demonstrated judicial demeanor in that hearing. And in fact, something like 3,000 law professors, including 40 from Yale, have come out and said, based on that performance, he should not be confirmed to the Supreme Court. Justice Stevens, John Paul Stevens, retired justice, extraordinary moment, said this man should not be confirmed for the Supreme Court. If you were from Mars, Mr. President, or from South Dakota, and you knew nothing about the history of this matter, you knew nothing about the documents, the opinions, the philosophy, none of those things. You knew nothing about those things. All you saw was that hearing that afternoon. You'd say, this guy has no business anywhere near a courtroom. Now, his defense is, I was angry. I was being charged with something. My family was being threatened, and I'm being threatened. And I understand that. All of us have thought about how we would feel if some unjust or untrue charge was made against us, whatever the nature, and a particularly heinous charge is made against him. I understand that he was passionate. But here's what really bothers me. What he said, the conspiracy, the direct insults to the Democratic senators, the idea that he was a victim of a smear and a smear campaign, he'd written down. That wasn't a spontaneous outburst. He was, so mad and caught up in the moment and said something he regretted. It was in his written testimony. He'd written it down. His answers to the questions. Back to canon number 2, avoid anything that would undermine confidence in the judiciary. He actually said, looking at the Democrats, what goes around comes around. Everybody knows that's a threat. And he's looking at Richard Blumenthal, who's the plaintiff in a case called Blumenthal versus Trump, which is in the federal district court in Washington and will eventually make its way to the Supreme Court based on the emoluments clause. How can Richard Blumenthal possibly believe he would get a fair and impartial hearing from somebody who said, what goes around comes around? That phrase itself should be disqualifying. Anybody who talks about a political party or a group of people or millions of people or anybody else and says what goes around comes around, that's disqualifying. So I think based upon judicial philosophy, his failure to recuse himself from issues involving the president who appointed him, his refusal to say that he will recuse himself in issues involving the president who appointed him, the incredible lack of documentation based upon his record and his demeanor last week disqualifies him. No, Mr. President, you don't have to believe Dr. Ford to conclude, as I have, that Judge Kavanaugh should not be elevated to the Supreme Court. But, Mr. President, before I close, I should add one note. I do believe Dr. Ford. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.